The winter of 1882 came early to Red Rock Canyon in the Arizona Territory, painting the layered sandstone cliffs with frost and dusting the rocky ledges with snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the pale morning light. It was on such a morning that two figures stood at the entrance of a cave carved deep into the canyon wall, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as they contemplated a decision that would change their lives forever. Coraline Ashford adjusted her worn wool shawl and pulled it tighter against the biting wind. At 24 years old, her hands were already rough from years of hard labor, and her face carried the weathered look of someone who had learned too young that life rarely offered kindness to those without means. Beside her stood her brother Tobias, just 18, tall and lanky with their father's dark hair and their mother's gentle eyes. He shifted nervously from foot to foot, not from the cold, but from the weight of what his sister was proposing. "This is really going to be our home?" Tobias asked, his voice echoing slightly against the stone walls that loomed before them. Coraline stared into the darkness of the cave, seeing not just rock and shadow, but possibility. "Father used to say that stone never betrays you. Only people betray." She spoke those words with the quiet conviction of someone who had learned their truth the hard way. For 12 years, those words had been her compass, guiding her through darkness that would have broken a lesser soul. The story of how Coraline and Tobias Ashford came to stand before a cave in the Arizona wilderness began not in the desert, but in the cold, darkened valleys of Pennsylvania. Their father, Edmund Ashford, had been a miner from Cornwall, England, a man who carried centuries of mining knowledge in his calloused hands. He had come to America seeking a better life, and for a time, he had found one. He married a woman named Margaret, daughter of Irish immigrants, and together they had two children, Coraline and Tobias. Edmund worked the mines near Ashland, Pennsylvania, and in the evenings, he would sit with young Coraline on his knee and teach her things that most people considered useless knowledge for a girl. He taught her about rock formations, about how the earth breathed and moved, about the constant temperature that existed deep below the surface. 6 feet down, he would say, his voice carrying the melodic lilt of his Cornish accent. The earth stays at 55 degrees, summer and winter alike. That's why the mines are warm when snow falls above and cool when the sun blazes. The earth remembers what the sky forgets. Coraline had listened with the intensity of a child who somehow knew these lessons would matter one day. She memorized every word, every principle, every technique her father shared. And when Tobias was old enough, their grandmother on their mother's side, a woman who still spoke with an Irish brogue and knew the old ways of healing, began teaching him about herbs and remedies, about how to coax life from death and health from sickness. Then came the morning of September 6, 1870. Coraline was 12 years old when the earth that her father loved so much decided to take him back. The Ashland mine collapse killed 23 men in a single, terrible moment. Edmund Ashford was among them. They never recovered his body. Margaret Ashford, who had survived poverty in Ireland and the dangerous Atlantic crossing, who had built a life from nothing in a country that wasn't her own, could not survive the loss of her husband. She died 3 months later, the doctor said, from pneumonia. But Coraline knew better. Her mother had simply stopped wanting to live. What happened next would haunt Coraline for the rest of her life. She and Tobias were orphans now, with no family willing to take in two children, and the authorities decided that separating them would make placement easier. Coraline was sent to one orphanage in Philadelphia. 6-year-old Tobias was sent to another in Pittsburgh. The memory of that separation never faded. Tobias, screaming her name as two women in gray dresses, pulled him toward a waiting wagon. Coraline fighting against hands that held her back, her voice going hoarse from crying out to her brother. The last thing she saw before they dragged her inside was Tobias's small face in the back of that wagon, tears streaming down his cheeks, his mouth forming the word Cora over and over again. "I'll find you," she had screamed. "I promise, Toby. I'll find you." She was 12 years old, and she had just made a vow that would define the next 6 years of her life. Every night as she lay on her narrow cot in the orphanage dormitory, she would repeat that promise to herself like a prayer. I will find you. I will keep you safe. I will never let anyone separate us again. The orphanage in Philadelphia was not a cruel place, not exactly, but it was not kind either. It was simply indifferent, a holding facility for children whom society had discarded. Coraline learned quickly that no one was coming to save her, that if she wanted to keep her promise to Tobias, she would have to save herself. At 14, she was hired out as a domestic servant to a wealthy family. The work was backbreaking. She scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, washed clothes until her hands cracked and bled, but she never complained. She saved every penny she earned, hiding coins in a small tin box that she kept beneath a loose floorboard. She wrote letters to Tobias every month, though the orphanage only forwarded some of them. She counted the days until he would turn 18 and be released from state care. The years crawled by with agonizing slowness. Coraline moved from household to household, enduring employers who ranged from merely dismissive to actively cruel. One woman beat her with a wooden spoon for breaking a dish. One man tried to corner her in the pantry late at night, and she had to fight him off with a kitchen knife. Through it all, she kept her eyes fixed on a single date, the day her brother would finally be free. On March 15, 1882, Tobias Ashford turned 18. Coraline was waiting at the Pittsburgh train station when he walked out of the orphanage gates for the last time. She barely recognized him. The small, crying boy she had last seen was now a young man, tall and thin, with a guarded look in his eyes that spoke of years spent protecting himself from a world that didn't care about orphans. But when he saw her standing there, when recognition dawned on his face, something in him cracked open. He ran to her and threw his arms around her, and for a long moment they just held each other, two broken pieces of a family finally made whole again. "You came," Tobias whispered against her shoulder. "You really came." "I promised," Coraline said, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. "I always keep my promises." They had nothing. Coraline's savings amounted to $47. Every cent she had managed to hide away over 6 years of labor. It wasn't enough to start a life in the East, where everything was expensive and opportunities for two orphans with no connections were nearly non-existent. But there was talk everywhere of the West, of free land and fresh starts, of a place where your past didn't matter as much as your willingness to work. "We'll go to Arizona territory," Coraline decided. "Land is cheap there. We can build something of our own." They bought train tickets that took them as far as their money would allow, then walked the rest of the way, picking up odd jobs along the route to keep themselves fed. Somewhere in New Mexico, they found Scout. He was a border collie mix, barely more than a puppy, abandoned on the side of the railroad tracks with a piece of rope still tied around his neck. He was half-starved and terrified, but when Tobias knelt down and extended his hand, the dog crept forward and licked his fingers. From that moment on, Scout was family. By the time they reached the Arizona territory, autumn was beginning to paint the desert in shades of gold and rust. They had $17 left, enough for a few weeks of supplies if they were careful. Coraline had heard there was unclaimed land near a place called Sweetwater, and she had allowed herself to hope that maybe finally their luck was about to change. It wasn't. The good land around Sweetwater was long gone, claimed years ago by settlers who had arrived with more money and better timing. What remained was either too expensive, too remote, or too hostile for farming or ranching. Every door Coraline knocked on, every inquiry she made, ended the same way. A shake of the head, a pitying look, sometimes a suggestion that she might find work as a domestic servant or that her brother could hire on as a ranch hand. She had not walked 1,000 miles and waited 6 years to become someone's servant again. Their money dwindled with terrifying speed. Within a week, they were sleeping in a tent that leaked when it rained and offered almost no protection from the increasingly cold nights. Within 2 weeks, they were down to their last $5. Winter was coming, and they had nowhere to go. It was Tobias who found the cave. He had been out gathering wild herbs, trying to remember the remedies his grandmother had taught him years ago, when a sudden rainstorm drove him to seek shelter. He ducked into what he thought was a small overhang in the canyon wall and discovered that it opened into something much larger. The cave was magnificent. The entrance was wide enough for a wagon to pass through, nearly 15 feet high and 20 feet across. But more impressive was what lay beyond. The cave extended back into the mountain, its ceiling arching upward in places to 20 feet or more. The floor was remarkably level, worn smooth by thousands of years of water flow that had long since found another course. And most importantly, even as the rain poured down outside and the temperature dropped, the cave remained dry and surprisingly warm. Tobias spent 3 days exploring every inch of that cave before he told his sister about it. He mapped its chambers, counted its air vents, tested its temperature at different times of day, and on the 4th day, he led Coraline through the rain to show her what he had found. She stood at the entrance for a long time, staring into the darkness, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities. The cave was everything their father had ever taught her about. Deep enough to maintain a stable temperature, natural ventilation through small fissures in the rock, protected from the elements by the canyon wall itself. Then she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Carved into the wall near the entrance, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a symbol. It was a cross pick and shovel, the mark of Cornish miners, a tradition that dated back centuries. Someone from her father's homeland had been here before, perhaps decades ago, and had left this sign for others who might follow. Coraline traced the carving with her fingertips, and for a moment she could almost feel her father standing beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice in her ear. "Stone never betrays you. Only people betray." "This is it," she said softly. "This is where we build." Tobias looked at her, then at the cave, then back at her. In his eyes, she could see the same mixture of fear and hope that she felt in her own heart. "Are you sure, Cora? Really sure?" She reached out and took his hand, the same hand she had held when they were children. Before the mine took their father, before sickness took their mother, before the world tried to tear them apart. "I'm sure of one thing," she said. "We have nothing left to lose, and that means we have everything to gain." The people of Sweetwater had never seen anything quite like what Coraline and Tobias Ashford began to do in Red Rock Canyon. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns, and soon everyone had an opinion about the 2 orphans who were building a home inside a cave. The work began immediately. Coraline sketched plans on scraps of paper, translating her father's teachings into practical construction. The first step was the wall. They would seal the cave entrance with stone, leaving space for a proper door and windows, creating a barrier between the interior and the harsh desert weather. Every stone had to be hauled from the canyon floor, some weighing 30 pounds, others closer to 50. Coraline's hands, already roughened by years of domestic labor, became raw and bleeding. Tobias worked beside her, his thin frame growing stronger with each passing day, his face set with determination that belied his youth. Scout lay near the entrance, watching them work, occasionally barking at rabbits or lizards that wandered too close. They mixed mortar from clay and dried grass, a technique Coraline remembered her father describing from the old country. The wall rose slowly, one stone at a time, each layer carefully leveled and secured before the next began. It was backbreaking labor, the kind that left them collapsing into their bedrolls at night, too exhausted even to eat. But slowly, impossibly, the wall took shape. They built the door frame from lumber salvaged from an abandoned homestead, constructing a double door with a 6-inch gap between the layers for insulation. The windows were more difficult. Glass was expensive and fragile, so they fashioned heavy wooden shutters that could be opened during the day for light and closed at night for warmth. Inside, Coraline divided the space into three areas: a main living area with a cooking hearth, a sleeping chamber with a heavy blanket hung for privacy, and a storage room for supplies and equipment. The hearth took the most planning. It had to be positioned to take advantage of the cave's natural ventilation, allowing smoke to escape through fissures in the ceiling while keeping heat inside. It took 3 attempts to get it right. The first arrangement filled the cave with choking smoke. The second drew too much cold air from outside, but the third, built at a precise angle that aligned with the natural air currents, worked perfectly. The smoke rose and disappeared into the rock, while the warmth radiated outward, filling the cave with comfortable heat. Tobias created a small herb garden near the entrance, where sunlight reached, planting the remedies his grandmother had taught him to cultivate: sage for fevers, yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain. The garden was tiny, but it represented something important: a claim on the future, a belief that they would still be here when spring came. 3 weeks after they began, the cave home was complete. The stone wall stood at 8 feet high and 2 feet thick, solid enough to stop a charging bull. The door hung level and true, sealing tight against the frame. Inside, the temperature hovered between 55 and 60 degrees, comfortable enough to need only a small fire in the hearth to stay warm. Coraline stood in the main chamber on that final day, looking around at what they had created. The hearth glowed with a small fire. The blanket curtains swayed gently in the natural air currents. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with the few supplies they had managed to acquire. It wasn't much by any standard, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, paid for with their own sweat and blood. Tobias came to stand beside her, Scout at his heels. "We did it, Cora. We actually did it." "We did." She allowed herself a small smile. Father would have been proud. He would have been more than proud. He would have been amazed. Tobias looked at the stone walls, at the perfect mortar joints, at the hearth that drew smoke so efficiently. "You learned all this from him when you were just a child?" "I learned it because I knew someday I might need it. I didn't know when or why, but I knew." She paused, her eyes distant. "When you spend your whole life with nothing, you hold on to everything anyone teaches you. Knowledge doesn't take up space. It doesn't cost money, and no one can take it away from you, no matter what else they steal." They had built a home from nothing, and that was when the trouble started. The first trip to Sweetwater after completing their cave home was supposed to be simple: buy supplies, perhaps find some work, begin the slow process of becoming part of the community. What Coraline and Tobias found instead was mockery. Henderson, the owner of the general store, was the first to laugh. He was a portly man with a permanent squint and a habit of speaking loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear. "You built a what?" He slapped his knee in exaggerated amusement. "A house in a cave? Like some kind of animals?" The news spread through Sweetwater faster than a prairie fire. By the time Coraline and Tobias finished their shopping, half the town knew about the crazy orphans living in a hole in the ground. People pointed and whispered. Children gathered in clusters, giggling and making burrowing motions with their hands. Mrs. Abigail Prescott, wife of the town banker and self-appointed arbiter of social propriety, stationed herself outside the general store and offered her opinion to anyone who would listen. "Poor things," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "No parents to raise them proper. No wonder they've turned out like this, living in a cave like heathens. Who would ever marry a girl who lives in a hole? And that poor brother, saddled with such a strange sister." The words cut deeper than Coraline let show. She had endured worse, far worse, in the years since her parents died. But there was something particularly cruel about being mocked for the very thing she was most proud of. the home she had built with her own hands from knowledge her father had passed down to her. Reverend Whitfield came next, his visit cloaked in the language of pastoral concern. "My children," he said, standing at the entrance to their cave with his Bible clutched to his chest, "the Lord intended for mankind to live in proper dwellings, not holes in the rock. This is the way of pagans, not Christians." Coraline met his gaze without flinching. "With respect, Reverend, Jesus Christ was born in a stable among animals. A cave is at least cleaner than that." The Reverend had no response to that. He left, muttering about pride and wickedness, and Coraline knew she had made an enemy. But the worst was yet to come. Marcus Harwell was the wealthiest man in the Sweetwater region. He owned thousands of acres of prime grazing land, ran hundreds of head of cattle, and employed half the working men in town. He was also, as Coraline would soon learn, a man who did not tolerate being refused. He arrived at the cave entrance on a gray morning, flanked by 3 of his ranch hands, all of them mounted on horses that probably cost more than everything Coraline and Tobias owned combined. Marcus was a large man in his mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had never been told no in his life. "So you're the cave dwellers," he said, looking down at them from his saddle. "I've heard about you. Everyone has." Coraline stood her ground. Beside her, Tobias gripped Scout's collar to keep the dog from growling. "We're the Ashfords," Coraline replied. "This is our home." Marcus laughed, a cold sound without warmth. "Home? That's what you call this?" He gestured at the cave entrance with obvious contempt. "Listen, girl, I came here to do you a favor. I have work available. You can cook and clean in my household. Your brother can shovel manure in my stables. It's honest work, more than cave rats deserve." "Thank you for the offer," Coraline said, her voice steady. "But we have a home, and we can find our own work." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flicker of surprise that quickly hardened into anger. Men like Marcus Harwell were not accustomed to being refused, especially by orphan girls with nothing to their names. "You think you're better than working for me? You who live in a hole in the ground like an animal?" "I think we're capable of taking care of ourselves." Marcus leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "Let me tell you something, girl. That piece of land you wanted to buy, the 40 acres near Miller's Creek, I purchased it last week. Every decent plot within 20 miles of Sweetwater belongs to me or someone who owes me. So unless you plan to live in that cave forever, you're going to need my help eventually. And when that day comes, when you come crawling to my door begging for work, remember that I offered you kindness first and you threw it back in my face." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following. Coraline watched them go, her hands trembling not with fear, but with rage. That night, sitting by the fire in their cave home, Tobias found his sister staring into the flames with an expression he had never seen before. "Cora, are you all right?" She was quiet for a long moment. "He bought that land to hurt us, Toby. He knew we wanted it, and he bought it just to make sure we couldn't have it." "What do we do?" Coraline turned to look at her brother, and in the firelight her eyes held the same determination that had carried her through 6 years of separation, through poverty and abuse and loneliness. "We finish what we started. We make this cave into a home that puts every house in Sweetwater to shame. And then we wait." "Wait for what?" "For winter to show them all how wrong they were." The weeks that followed tested every ounce of strength and resolve that Coraline and Tobias possessed. They finished the interior of the cave home, hanging blankets to create private spaces, building shelves for storage, creating a proper kitchen area with everything needed to cook and preserve food. But more importantly, they began to build a life. Coraline discovered that not everyone in Sweetwater shared Marcus Harwell's contempt. Some of the women in town needed sewing done, alterations and repairs that required skill and patience. As long as they didn't know she was the cave girl, they were happy to hire her. The work wasn't much, but it was something. Tobias found his own way. His grandmother's teachings about herbal medicine had not been forgotten, and word began to spread quietly that the young man from the canyon had remedies that actually worked. A tea that eased chest congestion, a salve that healed wounds without infection, a tincture that calmed colicky babies. People came to him secretly, embarrassed to be seen seeking help from a cave dweller, but desperate enough to swallow their pride. And then there was old Ezra. Ezra was the town blacksmith, a man of 70 years with skin like weathered leather and hands that could bend iron but touched everything with surprising gentleness. He was also the only black man in Sweetwater, a former slave who had walked to freedom 30 years ago and never stopped walking until he reached a place where no one could own him again. He came to visit the cave one afternoon, not to mock or preach, but simply to see what everyone was talking about. Coraline watched him examine the stone wall, run his hands along the mortar joints, study the way the door was hung. "Good work," he said finally. "Solid, built to last." Coraline didn't know how to respond. Compliments had been rare in her life. "My father was a miner," she said. "He taught me about stone." Ezra nodded slowly. "I know that look you've got, the look of someone who's got nothing left to lose. I had that look myself once." He turned to face her directly. "Those people in town, they're going to keep laughing, keep mocking, keep telling you that you're doing everything wrong. I know. Good, because here's what they don't know." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. 50 years ago, my master told me that a slave couldn't learn to read, said our brains weren't built for it. I taught myself anyway, nights when I should have been sleeping. Now I read better than his grandchildren." He smiled, revealing gaps where teeth used to be. "The people who tell you what you can't do are usually the ones who can't do anything themselves. Remember that." He left them with a gift, a set of tools he had forged himself, stronger and better than anything they could have afforded to buy. When Coraline tried to pay him, he refused. "Just promise me something," he said. "When you prove them all wrong, and you will, don't become like them. Don't forget what it was like to be the one people laughed at." "I promise." As October faded into November and November into December, the temperature dropped and the cave proved its worth. While other homes in the region burned through cords of firewood trying to stay warm, while families huddled around stoves that couldn't keep the chill at bay, Coraline and Tobias lived in remarkable comfort. The cave's natural temperature of 55 degrees meant they needed only a small fire to raise it to a cozy 65. They used a quarter of the firewood their neighbors burned. Word got around, as it always did. Some said it was witchcraft. Others said it was a trick, that the orphans were lying about how warm their cave was. Marcus Harwell led his ranch hands out for another round of mockery, standing at the canyon rim and shouting down at them. "Still alive down there, cave rats? Don't worry, real winter hasn't come yet. When it does, we'll find your frozen bodies in the spring." His men laughed. Coraline said nothing. She simply went back inside, where the fire crackled warmly and Scout dozed on his blanket and waited for the winter that everyone said would kill them. But before that terrible winter arrived, something unexpected happened. It was late November, well past midnight, when a soft knock came at the cave door. Coraline opened it to find a woman standing in the darkness, wrapped in a fine wool cloak that was far too expensive for anyone who should be visiting cave dwellers at this hour. Constance Harwell, Marcus Harwell's wife. "Please," Constance whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the canyon rim, as if afraid her husband's men might be watching. "My daughter Lily is sick. The doctor in town says there's nothing more he can do. But I've heard your brother has remedies that actually work." Coraline stared at her for a long moment. This was the wife of the man who had tried to destroy them, the woman who had stood silently by while her husband mocked and humiliated them. "Please," Constance said again, and her voice cracked. "She's only 8 years old. I'll pay anything, do anything. Just help my daughter." Tobias appeared behind Coraline, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he heard what was happening, he didn't hesitate. "Bring her tomorrow night," he said. "Same time. I'll have medicine ready." "Thank you," Constance breathed. "Thank you. But my husband cannot know. He would never allow—" "We understand," Coraline said quietly. "Your husband's pride is his own burden. Your daughter shouldn't have to suffer for it." For 3 weeks, Constance Harwell came to the cave in secret, bringing Lily for treatment. Tobias made teas from herbs his grandmother had taught him to cultivate, applied poultices that smelled of sage and honey, and slowly, carefully, the little girl recovered. On their last visit, Constance pressed a small purse of coins into Coraline's hands. "This is too much," Coraline said, trying to give it back. "It's not nearly enough." Constance's eyes were wet with tears. "You saved my daughter's life while my husband was trying to ruin yours. I will never forget that. Never." She paused at the door, looking back at the cave that had sheltered her child. "Not everyone in the Harwell family is the same," she said softly. "Remember that." Then she was gone, disappearing into the night with her daughter, back to the grand house where her husband slept, never knowing that his wife had been seeking help from the very people he despised. If you've ever been looked down upon because of where you come from or what you don't have, you understand what Coraline and Tobias were feeling. The weight of being judged not for who you are, but for what people assume you to be. Take a moment to like this video if you believe these two orphans are going to prove everyone wrong. Their story is just getting started. The first sign came on December 20th. Coraline noticed it while hanging laundry outside the cave entrance. The birds that normally flock to the canyon in search of food were gone, every single one of them. The sky had a strange quality to it, a yellowish tinge that she had never seen before, but that stirred something in her memory, some half-forgotten warning her father had spoken years ago. She went to find old Ezra that afternoon. "Barometric pressure's dropping," he said, studying the sky with the expression of someone who had learned to read weather the hard way. "I've been alive 70 years. Never seen a sky look quite like that." "What does it mean?" "It means something bad is coming. Something worse than anything this territory has seen in a long time. Stock up on food, girl. Fill every container you have with water. And whatever you do, don't leave that cave until it's over." Coraline took his advice. Over the next 2 days, she and Tobias worked frantically, hauling water from the creek, gathering firewood, purchasing every bit of dried meat and flour that Henderson would sell them. The storekeeper laughed at their urgency. "Hoarding supplies like the world's ending," he said to the other customers. "Cave living must be making them crazy." But Coraline noticed that some of the old-timers, people who had been in the territory for decades, weren't laughing. They were watching the sky with the same worried expression old Ezra wore. December 23rd dawned clear and cold, impossibly, deceptively clear. The sky was a perfect blue, and the sun shone with a brilliance that seemed almost cheerful. Coraline wasn't fooled. The air had a strange stillness to it, a held breath quality that made Scout whine and pace near the door. She had to go into Sweetwater that morning. A woman had ordered a dress altered for Christmas, and Coraline needed the money too badly to delay the delivery. She left Tobias at the cave with strict instructions. "If the weather changes, don't wait for me. Close the door and stay inside." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I'll find shelter somewhere." She rode Belle, their aging mare, into town. The delivery went smoothly enough, though Mrs. Patterson couldn't resist commenting on Coraline's peculiar living situation. Coraline collected her payment and headed for the general store to pick up a few final supplies. She was inside Henderson's store when the sky fell. It happened that fast. One moment the sun was shining through the windows. The next, the light simply disappeared, as if someone had blown out a lantern. Coraline ran to the door and saw a wall of black cloud rolling in from the north, moving faster than any storm she had ever witnessed. Lightning flickered within its depths, and the temperature was already plummeting. "Everyone inside!" Henderson shouted. "Get away from the windows!" But Coraline was already running for the stable where Belle was tied. Tobias was alone in that cave, 8 miles away, and nothing on earth was going to stop her from getting back to him. "You'll die out there!" Henderson yelled after her. "Girl, come back!" She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had promised to take care of her brother, and she would die before she broke that promise. The first snowflakes hit her face before she cleared the town limits. By the time she was a mile out, she couldn't see the hand in front of her face. The wind screamed around her, driving snow horizontally with such force that it felt like being sandblasted. Belle, normally a steady and reliable horse, was trembling and struggling to walk. 8 miles. In good weather, it would take less than 2 hours. In this, it might as well have been 800. Coraline lost track of time, lost track of distance, lost track of everything except the desperate need to keep moving forward. She guided Belle more by memory than by sight, trying to recall the landmarks she couldn't see. The old oak tree at the 2-mile mark, the dry creek bed at 4 miles, the rock formation that meant she was halfway home. She found none of them. The world had become a featureless white void, and she was lost in it. At some point, Belle stumbled. The horse went down hard, throwing Coraline from the saddle. She landed in snow that was already knee-deep, the cold cutting through her clothes like knives. She tried to stand, tried to help Belle up, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold was doing something to her mind, making her thoughts slow and fuzzy. A distant part of her knew that was dangerous, that it meant she was freezing, but she couldn't seem to care anymore. She lay in the snow, watching the white flakes fall around her, and thought about Tobias. She had promised to find him. She had promised to take care of him. And now she was going to die in a blizzard, and he would be alone again, just like before. "I'm sorry, Toby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The hands that grabbed her were rough and strong. Someone was shouting her name, but the voice seemed to come from very far away. She felt herself being lifted, felt the heat of another body pressed against her frozen limbs, and then everything went black. She woke to firelight. For a long, confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the familiar stone ceiling came into focus, and she realized she was home, in the cave. In her bed, Tobias's face appeared above her, pale with worry. "Cora, thank God. I thought you were—" "How?" she managed to croak. "Old Ezra. He followed you from town, found you and Belle about 3 miles out." Tobias's voice broke. "Cora, you almost died. If he hadn't found you—" She tried to sit up, and pain lanced through her body. Every muscle ached. Her hands and feet felt like they were on fire, the pins and needles sensation of frozen flesh coming back to life. "Ezra? Over there!" She turned her head and saw the old blacksmith lying in the corner, his left leg wrapped in bandages that Tobias had applied. He was conscious, his weathered face tight with pain. "Broke my leg getting you up that canyon wall," Ezra said. "Horse slipped. Worth it, though." He managed a weak smile. "Told you not to leave that cave." Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry. Snow piled against the stone wall, higher with each passing hour. But inside the cave, with the fire crackling in the hearth and the thick walls blocking the worst of the cold, they were safe. The storm raged for 3 days. Coraline recovered quickly once she was warm, her young body bouncing back from the near-fatal cold. She spent most of that time caring for Ezra, whose broken leg required constant attention, and watching the incredible fury of nature through the small windows in their wall. The temperature outside dropped to -30 degrees. The wind gusted to 70 miles per hour. Snow accumulated at a rate of nearly a foot per day. On the morning of December 26th, Tobias heard something that cut through even the shriek of the storm. Voices, human voices, crying out for help. He grabbed Coraline's arm. "Do you hear that?" She did, faint but unmistakable, somewhere to the south. "Stay here," she said, already reaching for her coat. "Cora, no. You almost died 2 days ago. And someone is dying right now." She met his eyes. "Take care of Ezra. Keep the fire going. And be ready to receive visitors. A lot of them." She fought her way up the canyon wall to a vantage point where she could see despite the blowing snow, and what she witnessed made her blood run cold. 6 wagons were stranded on the main road, perhaps half a mile south of the canyon. Some had overturned, others were buried to their axles in snowdrifts, and scattered around them, like broken dolls, were people, dozens of people. Some were moving, struggling to stand or crawl toward each other. Others were ominously still. Coraline made 3 trips through that hellish storm. Each trip was worse than the last. Each trip took more out of her than she thought she had to give. Each trip brought her face to face with the terrible mathematics of disaster, the calculation of who could be saved and who was already beyond help. The first trip brought back the Morrison family. Hollis was a farmer from Nebraska, 35 years old, with the calloused hands of a man who had worked hard his entire life. When Coraline found him, he was trying to dig his family out of a snowdrift with his bare hands, his fingers already turning black from frostbite. His wife, Winifred, 32, was barely conscious when Coraline found her. She had given her coat to her children hours earlier and had nearly frozen to death as a result. Her lips were blue, her skin was gray, and she couldn't stop shaking. Their 3 children ranged in age from 9 to 4. The oldest, a boy named Frederick, was trying to help his father dig, his small hands bleeding in the snow. The middle child, a girl named Rosalind, sat motionless in the wagon, staring at nothing, in shock from the cold and the terror. And the youngest, a girl named Letty, was not moving at all. She lay in her mother's arms, limp as a rag doll, her tiny face the color of old snow. Coraline carried the child herself, running through the snow as fast as her legs would take her, praying with every step that she wasn't too late. Behind her, Hollis carried his wife, and the 2 older children stumbled along in their wake, too cold and too scared to cry anymore. The second trip brought more survivors. Samuel Chen, a Chinese merchant from San Francisco, whose wagon had broken an axle in the storm. His feet were so badly frostbitten he could barely walk. Pernilla Holloway, a school teacher heading to a new position, and Opaline Brennan, a 50-year-old widow who had broken her ankle when her wagon overturned. 3 cowboys named Jake, Daniel, and Miguel, who had been driving a herd of cattle to market. The cattle were gone, scattered or frozen, but the men had survived. It was the third trip that changed everything. Coraline found them in an overturned wagon, huddled together for warmth. There were 3 of them, a young woman of 17 with terror in her eyes, a little girl of 8, and a woman in her 40s who was unconscious and bleeding heavily from a wound in her thigh, where a piece of broken wood had impaled her. The young woman looked up when Coraline pulled open the wagon's canvas cover. "Please," she sobbed, "please help us. My aunt is dying." Coraline looked at the older woman and felt her heart stop. She knew that face. She had seen it before, at the cave entrance late at night, begging for help. Constance Harwell. Marcus Harwell's wife. And the little girl clinging to her was Lily Harwell, the child Tobias had healed just weeks ago. "Get up," Coraline said to the young woman. "We don't have much time." "But my aunt, we can't move her like this. She'll bleed to death. She'll freeze to death if we leave her here. Now move." Carrying an unconscious, bleeding woman through a blizzard was the hardest thing Coraline had ever done. The young woman, who introduced herself as Dorothea Harwell, Marcus's niece, helped as much as she could. Little Lily walked between them, holding on to Coraline's coat with fingers that were blue from cold. "You're the cave lady," Lily said at one point, her voice barely audible over the wind. "The one Uncle Marcus makes fun of." Coraline didn't answer. She just kept walking. They made it to the cave as the light was fading, what little light the storm allowed. Tobias was waiting at the entrance, and his face went white when he saw who Coraline was carrying. "Is that—" "Yes. She's hurt badly. We need to work fast." 19 people crowded into the cave that night. 19 people who had expected to die in the snow, who had given up hope, who had already begun composing final prayers and last messages to loved ones who would never receive them. And they found themselves in a place that defied everything they had been told about the world. The cave was warm, not just bearable, but actually warm. The fire crackled in its hearth, and the stone walls radiated a gentle heat that seeped into frozen bones and thawing limbs. The air was fresh despite the crowd, the natural ventilation pulling smoke upward and fresh air in. There was food, water, blankets, everything they needed to survive. "My God," Hollis Morrison breathed as he helped his wife and children inside. "It's like summer in here." Tobias worked without stopping. Little Letty Morrison was his first priority, and he spent 6 hours on her, warming her slowly with heated stones wrapped in cloth, forcing tiny sips of warm broth between her blue lips, never leaving her side even when his own hands cramped from the constant motion. He remembered everything his grandmother had taught him, the way to warm a frozen body slowly, so slowly, because warming too fast could kill as surely as the cold itself. The herbs that could stimulate circulation without overworking a weakened heart. The prayers and songs she had sung to sick children in Ireland. Melodies that somehow seemed to help even when nothing else did. He sang those songs now, his voice rough and tired, the words half remembered but no less powerful for that. Old Irish lullabies about green hills and gentle rain, about mothers who never stopped loving their children and ancestors who watched over the living from beyond the veil. He sang until his voice gave out, and then he just hummed, one hand on Letty's tiny chest, feeling for the heartbeat that seemed so faint, so fragile, so easily extinguished. Her mother, Winifred, sat beside him the entire time, watching with eyes that had already prepared themselves for grief. "She's not going to make it," Winifred whispered at one point. "I know she's not." "Don't say that," Tobias replied without looking up. "Don't you dare say that." The hours crawled by. The storm screamed outside, and inside the cave, a young man who had learned healing from his Irish grandmother fought for a little girl's life with everything he had. At 3 in the morning, Letty opened her eyes. The first thing she said in a voice barely louder than a whisper was, "Mama, the angel boy saved me." Winifred Morrison collapsed against Tobias and wept. And for a long moment he just held her, this stranger, this woman he had never met before tonight, and let her cry. Across the cave, Coraline was dealing with a different crisis. Constance Harwell's wound was deep and still bleeding, despite everything she tried to do to stop it. If they had been in a proper town, with a proper doctor, Constance might have had a chance. But they were in a cave in the middle of a blizzard, with nothing but Tobias's herbs and Coraline's determination. She cleaned the wound as best she could. She applied a poultice of yarrow and honey that Tobias had prepared. She stitched the torn flesh close using a needle and thread, meant for mending clothes, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. When she finally finished, Constance was still unconscious, but the bleeding had stopped. "Will she live?" Dorothea asked. The young woman had not left her aunt's side all night. "I don't know," Coraline admitted, "but I've done everything I can." Dorothea was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that Coraline did not expect. "I'm sorry." "For what?" For the things I said about you, the things I thought. Dorothea looked at her, and there were tears on her cheeks. Uncle Marcus told us you were, he said you were trash, cave rats, people who didn't deserve help. But you saved us. You saved all of us. And my uncle, she couldn't finish. Your uncle isn't here, Coraline said. And none of that matters right now. What matters is getting everyone through this storm alive. Dawn came eventually, though you couldn't tell from looking outside. The storm still raged, the wind still howled, and the snow still fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face. But inside the cave, 19 people were alive who should have been dead. Samuel Chen, the Chinese merchant, approached Coraline as she was preparing breakfast for everyone. I have traveled from San Francisco, he said, his English accented but clear. I have seen many things, but I have never seen anyone do what you did last night. In my country, we have a saying, when you save a life, you are responsible for it forever. Coraline shook her head. I didn't save anyone. We just gave people a place to stay. No. Samuel's eyes were serious. You gave them more than that. You gave them a chance when everyone else would have left them to die. That is not nothing. That is everything. The 3rd day in the cave was the hardest. Food was running low. Water had to be melted from snow. 19 people in a space meant for 2 created tensions that threatened to boil over. One of the cowboys, Jake, complained loudly about having to share space with a Chinaman. Samuel Chen said nothing in response, but his jaw tightened in a way that spoke volumes. Coraline stepped between them before anything could escalate. We don't have time for this, she said, her voice flat and hard. We don't have energy for this. Everyone in this cave is alive because everyone in this cave worked together. If anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to step outside and take their chances with the storm. Jake glared at her for a long moment, then looked away. The matter was not raised again. That night, Constance Harwell finally woke. She was weak and confused, but alive. When she realized where she was, when she saw Coraline's face looking down at her, she began to cry. You saved me, she whispered. After everything my husband did to you, you saved my life. Your life was worth saving, Coraline replied simply. What your husband thinks of me doesn't change that. He's wrong. Marcus is wrong about so many things. Constance reached out and took Coraline's hand. Thank you. I will never forget this. Never. On the 4th night, with the storm finally beginning to weaken, the people in the cave gathered around the fire and shared their stories. It was Pernilla Holloway who suggested it, the school teacher with a sharp mind and the kind heart. We've been through something terrible together, she said. We should know each other's names, each other's stories. And so they talked. For hours they talked. Hollis Morrison talked about the farm in Nebraska that he hoped was still standing. He had built it himself, he said, board by board and nail by nail. It wasn't much, but it was his. And now I don't even know if there's anything left. Don't know if the animal survived. Don't know if the house is still there. His voice cracked. But we're alive. My family's alive. And that's more than I dared hope for 3 days ago. Winifred told of the family waiting for them in California. Her sister had written letters for months, describing the warm weather, the endless opportunities, the fresh start that waited for them on the other side of the desert. We were so close, she said, holding Letty on her lap. The little girl had recovered remarkably thanks to Tobias's tireless care, and was now eating soup with the healthy appetite of a child who had been very sick and was getting better. So close. And then the storm came. Samuel Chen described the shop he planned to open in Sweetwater, selling goods from the Orient that no one in the territory had ever seen. Silk and tea and porcelain and medicines. My father ran such a shop in San Francisco, he said. When he died, I decided to go somewhere new, somewhere I could build something of my own. He looked around the cave, at the stone walls and the warm fire, and the people who had become, in some strange way, a family. I think I chose the right place. Old Ezra, from his corner, told stories of the old days, of slavery and freedom, of the long walk north and the years of building a new life in a country that still didn't quite know what to do with him. I've seen a lot of storms in my time, and he said, weather storms and people storms. This one's bad, but I've seen worse. And we're going to get through it. We're going to get through it because people like Coraline and Tobias don't know how to give up. By the time the stories wound down and people began to settle in for sleep, something had changed in that cave. They had entered as strangers, as disparate individuals thrown together by catastrophe. They were leaving whenever the storm let them, as something else, as witnesses to each other's lives, as people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and had chosen compassion over judgment. Pernilla Holloway, the school teacher, asked Coraline about the cave. How did you know to build this way? The walls, the ventilation, the heating. It's like something from a university textbook. Coraline smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in days. My father was a miner from Cornwall. He taught me that the earth has a memory. 6 feet down, it's always 55 degrees. It doesn't matter if there's a blizzard above or a heat wave. The earth remembers what the sky forgets. She looked around at the stone walls, the flickering fire, the people who had found refuge in her home. I just listened to what he taught me. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. He died when I was 12, but he left me everything that mattered. The people who had mocked these orphans were now being saved by them. If this story is touching your heart, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have done in Coraline's position? We're about to see what happens when the storm finally breaks. The storm ended on the morning of December 28th. Coraline woke to something she had almost forgotten existed: silence. No howling wind, no groaning timbers, no constant white noise of snow driving against stone. Just peaceful, impossible silence. She opened the cave door and stepped into a transformed world. Snow lay 6 feet deep in places, burying fences and outbuildings and covering the land in a blanket of white that stretched to the horizon. The sun shone from a cloudless sky, so bright on the snow that it hurt to look at. And riding toward the canyon, black shapes against all that white, was a group of horsemen. Marcus Harwell led them. Coraline recognized him even at a distance, by the way he sat his horse, by the expensive cut of his coat. He was riding hard, pushing his mount through drifts that came up to the animal's chest, and there was something in his posture that she had never seen before. Fear. He was afraid. The riders reached the canyon rim and began to pick their way down the treacherous path to the cave. Coraline stood at the entrance and waited for them, her face carefully blank. Marcus was the first to dismount. He stumbled through the snow toward her, his eyes wild, his voice cracking. My wife, my daughter Lily, my niece Dorothea. They were on the road from Tucson. The storm caught them. Have you seen them? Have you heard anything? Coraline said nothing. She simply stepped aside and gestured toward the cave entrance. Marcus pushed past her and disappeared inside. A moment later, she heard his voice, raw with emotion, calling Constance's name, then Lily's, then Dorothea's. Then silence. When he emerged several minutes later, he was a different man. The arrogance was gone. The contempt was gone. In its place was something Coraline had never expected to see on Marcus Harwell's face: shame. He walked up to her slowly, as if each step cost him something precious. Behind him, the other riders watched in astonishment. You saved them, he said. You saved my family. I saved everyone who needed saving. I know, I saw. 19 people in there, and they all told me what you did. How you went out into that storm again and again. How your brother worked all night to save the Morrison girl. His voice broke. I called you cave rats. I tried to destroy you. I bought that land just to hurt you, and you saved my wife's life. Yes. Why? After everything I did, why would you help my family? Coraline looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the still morning air. My father used to say that you can tell everything about a person by how they treat people who can't help them. Your wife couldn't help me. Your niece couldn't help me. That little girl certainly couldn't help me. But they needed help, so I helped them. She paused. That's the difference between us, Mr. Harwell. You only help people who can do something for you. I help people because they need it. Marcus Harwell, who had built an empire through ruthlessness and intimidation, who had never apologized for anything in his 55 years of life, dropped to his knees in the snow. I was wrong, he said. I was wrong about everything. Yes, you were. 30 years ago, I came to this territory with nothing. Like you. People called me names, treated me like dirt, and a Mexican family took me in, gave me shelter in their barn, fed me when I had nothing. I survived because of their kindness. He looked up at her, and there were tears on his weathered cheeks. I forgot. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what it was like to be the one who needed help. I became the kind of man who would have turned myself away. He paused, his voice breaking. When I bought that land to spite you, I told myself I was teaching you a lesson, teaching you that you couldn't just waltz into this territory and expect to succeed without knowing the right people, without playing by my rules. But I wasn't teaching you anything. I was punishing you for reminding me of who I used to be, for having the courage I had lost. He gestured at the cave around them, at the people recovering from frostbite and exposure, at the fire that had kept them all alive. You built this with nothing. You saved my family with nothing. You did exactly what I did 30 years ago, except you did it better. You did it without becoming cruel. You did it without forgetting what matters. Coraline was quiet for a moment. Then she extended her hand. Get up, Mr. Harwell. You have a wife in there who needs you. And standing in the snow, feeling sorry for yourself, won't help anyone. He took her hand and stood. For a moment they faced each other, the orphan girl and the cattle baron, and something passed between them that neither would ever fully be able to describe. I'm going to make this right, Marcus said. I don't know how yet, but I will. Start by treating people better than you've treated us. That would be a good beginning. Sometimes the people who judge us the harshest are the ones who have forgotten their own struggles. Marcus Harwell learned that lesson the hard way. If you've stayed with this story this far, please take a moment to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The final chapter of Coraline and Tobias's journey is about to unfold. The days following the storm were a revelation. Word spread quickly through the region about what had happened at Red Rock Canyon, about how 2 orphans living in a cave had saved 19 lives, about how the people of Sweetwater had mocked and ridiculed them, only to be rescued by them when disaster struck. Henderson, the storekeeper, came to the cave 3 days after the storm ended. He stood at the entrance with his hat in his hands, unable to meet Coraline's eyes. I laughed at you, he said, called you crazy, told everyone in town that you'd freeze to death by Christmas. I remember. I was wrong. I was worse than wrong. I was cruel. He finally looked up. I'm sorry for all of it. Your apology is accepted, Mr. Henderson. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She turned to go back inside, but his voice stopped her. Wait, I want to learn. The way you built this place, the way it stayed warm while my store nearly froze. I want to understand how you did it. Coraline turned back surprised. You want me to teach you? I want to learn, and I think I'm not the only one. He was right. Over the following weeks, a stream of visitors came to Red Rock Canyon, not to mock, but to study, to learn, to understand. Coraline found herself explaining the principles her father had taught her again and again: the thermal mass of stone, the insulating properties of earth, the natural ventilation that kept air fresh while retaining heat, the constant temperature 6 feet below the surface that could be harnessed for both heating and cooling. Pernilla Holloway, the school teacher, took careful notes and made detailed sketches. She was planning to write an article for an educational journal back east, she said. The world needed to know about this. Samuel Chen became a regular visitor. He opened his shop in Sweetwater as planned, and it quickly became successful. He never forgot what Coraline had done for him, and he repaid it in 1,000 small ways. From fresh vegetables to bolts of fabric, to a steady stream of customers who just happened to need sewing done. Old Ezra's leg healed slowly, but it healed. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he never complained about it. Small price to pay, he would say whenever anyone mentioned it. Small price for doing the right thing. The Morrison family settled on a small plot of land not far from the canyon. They became like extended family to Coraline and Tobias, visiting regularly, sharing meals and stories, and the kind of connection that can only come from surviving something terrible together. Little Letty, the girl Tobias had saved, followed him around like a devoted puppy whenever she visited. She called him her angel boy, and nothing anyone said could convince her to stop. Constance Harwell recovered fully from her injuries. She came to thank Coraline personally, bringing gifts and offering friendship, and this time Coraline accepted. Constance was not her husband, and the friendship between the two women would prove to be one of the most important relationships of Coraline's life. Marcus Harwell was true to his word. He returned the 40 acres he had bought to spite them, signing the deed over to Coraline and Tobias without asking for a cent in payment. He offered to help them build a proper house, to invest in whatever business they wanted to start. Coraline refused the help but accepted the land. "We'll build what we build with our own hands," she told him. "That's how we've always done it. That's how we'll always do it." "I understand." He paused. "But if you ever need anything, anything at all, my door's open. That's a promise I won't break." Spring came to Arizona territory, melting the snow and revealing the damage beneath. 9 people had died in the blizzard across the Sweetwater region. 47 head of cattle had frozen to death. 12 homes had collapsed under the weight of snow, and 23 more had been severely damaged. The economic impact would be felt for years. But from the tragedy came something unexpected: a community reborn. Coraline walked through Sweetwater a few weeks after the storm, and the difference was palpable. People who had crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to say hello. Women who had whispered behind their hands now smiled and waved. Children who had chanted "cave rats" now tugged at their mother's skirts and asked if they could go visit the cave home in the canyon. It wasn't just gratitude, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper. The storm had stripped away the pretenses that people hide behind, the social hierarchies and artificial distinctions that seem so important when times are good. When you're huddled together for survival, when your life depends on a stranger's kindness, the color of someone's skin or the size of their house stops mattering. What matters is whether they'll help you, whether they'll open their door when the world is trying to kill you. Coraline had opened her door, and Sweetwater would never forget it. 7 families approached Coraline that spring, asking to learn how to build underground shelters like hers. She taught them for free, sharing her father's knowledge as freely as he had shared it with her. By summer, there were 8 new structures in the region built on the same principles as the cave home: earth-sheltered, thermally efficient, capable of weathering any storm nature could throw at them. Tobias opened what he called a healing house, though others called it a clinic. He had no formal medical training, no degrees or certificates, but he had something that mattered more: knowledge that actually worked and a genuine desire to help people. His grandmother's remedies, refined through practice and experimentation, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Mothers brought their sick children to him. Miners injured in accidents sought his care. Even Marcus Harwell's most expensive livestock received Tobias's treatments when the regular veterinarian couldn't help. And on a warm day in May 1883, Coraline stood outside the cave home and watched her brother work in his herb garden, and she allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Before we continue to the final part of this story, I want to take a moment. If Coraline and Tobias's journey has meant something to you, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who proved the world wrong. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this video with them. Sometimes the stories we share can change someone's day, or even their life. The years that followed were good ones. By 1888, Coraline and Tobias had built a proper farmhouse on their 40 acres, a beautiful structure that incorporated everything they had learned about earth-sheltered design. The main living areas were built into a hillside, staying cool in summer and warm in winter without burning a stick of firewood. Above ground, a conventional wooden facade gave the house a normal appearance, but beneath the surface, the principles of the cave home lived on. The farm itself was modest but productive. They raised chickens and goats, kept a small orchard of fruit trees, grew vegetables in a garden that Tobias tended with the same care he gave to his patients. They were not rich by any measure, but they had enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough security to know that they would never again face the desperate uncertainty of those first months in Arizona. More importantly, they had something that no amount of money could buy. They had each other, and they had the respect of a community that had once scorned them. They kept the original cave, of course. It had become something more than just a home. It was a symbol, a landmark, a place where travelers could always find shelter and strangers could always find a meal. Coraline hung a wooden sign at the entrance, "Haven where no one is turned away." Below it, in smaller letters, she added, "Built on the knowledge of Edmund Ashford Cornwall, 1835-1870. By his children, 1882. Scout lived to the remarkable age of 11, dying peacefully in his sleep one autumn morning in 1887. They buried him beside the cave entrance, marking the spot with a flat stone inscribed with simple words, 'Scout, our first family, 1876-1897. Old Ezra passed away the winter before, slipping quietly from life during the night. His will left the blacksmith shop to Tobias, along with a letter that Coraline would keep for the rest of her life. "You showed me," Ezra had written, "that the world is not always cruel, that kindness still exists, that two orphans with nothing can build something that lasts. I am proud to have known you. I am proud to have helped you. And wherever I go next, I will tell everyone I meet about the cave in Red Rock Canyon and the extraordinary people who built it." Letty Morrison grew up. The 4-year-old girl who had nearly died in the blizzard became a young woman, then a beautiful bride. She married Tobias on a June day in 1893 in a ceremony held at the cave entrance, surrounded by friends and family in the community that had grown up around the legacy of that terrible winter. Coraline served as maid of honor. She was 35 years old, still unmarried, still fiercely independent. People asked her sometimes why she had never found a husband. "I have a brother who's my family," she would say. "I have a farm that's my work. I have a community that's my purpose. What more does anyone need?" But those who knew her well noticed that Samuel Chen visited rather more often than strictly necessary, and that Coraline smiled when she saw him coming, and that they would sometimes sit together on the stone bench outside the cave, talking quietly as the sun set over the canyon. In 1891, a group of researchers from the University of Arizona came to study the cave home. They arrived with skepticism and expecting to find primitive construction in lucky circumstances. They left with pages of notes and a profound respect for what they had witnessed. They measured temperatures at different times of day and night in different seasons. They analyzed airflow with smoke tests, watching in amazement as the natural ventilation drew fresh air through channels that no engineer had designed. They documented the construction techniques, the mortar composition, the angle of the walls. Their report was published in an academic journal that following year, and it caused quite a stir in engineering circles. The Ashford Cave home, the report concluded, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of thermal mass, earth sheltering, and passive climate control that rivals modern engineering principles. The structure maintains a consistent internal temperature of 55-58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, despite external temperature fluctuations ranging from 20 degrees to 110 degrees. The construction techniques employed, while derived from traditional Cornish mining practices, align perfectly with contemporary theories of sustainable architecture. Coraline read the report twice, then set it aside with a quiet smile. Father always said educated men would eventually figure out what working men had known for centuries. He just didn't think it would take this long. The last scene of this story takes place on a winter evening in 1895. Coraline was 37 years old. Her hair had begun to show the first threads of gray, and her hands bore the marks of decades of hard work. Lines had formed around her eyes and mouth, the kind of lines that come from both hardship and laughter. But her eyes were still sharp, her mind still keen, and her determination still undiminished. She sat at the entrance to the cave with Tobias, now 31, and the father of 2 children. His daughter Adelaide, 5 years old with her mother's eyes and her father's gentle nature, played nearby with a new puppy, a border collie mix not unlike Scout had been. The sound of her laughter echoed off the canyon walls, mixing with the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. The sun was setting, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of orange and gold, the same colors that had greeted Coraline and Tobias when they first stood at this entrance 13 years ago. So much had changed since then. So much had stayed the same. "Do you remember," Tobias asked as if reading her thoughts, "that first day when we stood here and you said this would be our home? I remember thinking we were either very brave or very foolish," Coraline replied. "I still don't know which." "Both," Tobias said with a smile. "We were both." A wagon appeared on the road below, moving slowly through the light snow that was falling. A young family Coraline saw as they drew closer, a man and woman, both clearly exhausted, with 2 small children bundled against the cold. The wagon stopped at the base of the canyon, and the man called up uncertainly, "Excuse me, we've lost our way and my wife is ill. Is there some place we could rest for the night?" Coraline stood up and brushed the snow from her skirt. She looked at the cave entrance, at the warm glow of firelight spilling out into the winter darkness, at the sign that had welcomed so many strangers over the years. "This is Haven," she called back. "This is home. And home is for everyone who needs it." She watched them make their way up the canyon path, the father carrying one child while the mother leaned on his arm with the other child on her hip. They were tired and scared and desperate, just as she and Tobias had been all those years ago, just as so many others had been. Tobias appeared beside her with blankets and hot soup, already prepared, as if he had known they were coming. "Father would be proud," he said quietly. "Father is here," Coraline replied, "in every stone we laid, in every life we saved, in every lesson we passed on." She paused, watching the family approach. "He never really left us, Toby. He just found a different way to stay." The family reached the cave entrance, and Coraline stepped forward to greet them. "Welcome to Haven. Come in and warm yourselves. There's food and fire and beds enough for everyone." The mother looked at the cave entrance with confusion. "You live in a cave?" Coraline smiled, the same smile she had worn when people first laughed at her idea, when they called her crazy, when they said she would never survive. "We don't live in a cave," she said. "We live in a home. The best home we could build with our own hands and the knowledge our father passed down to us." She gestured toward the warm interior, toward the fire and the food and the safety within. "Come inside. Let me tell you about it." The cave at Red Rock Canyon still stands today. The wooden sign has been replaced several times over the decades, but the words have never changed. Haven, where no one is turned away. The Arizona Historical Society maintains the site as a testament to the ingenuity and compassion of two orphans who turned Mockery into legacy. The cave has become something more than a historical landmark. It has become a pilgrimage site for people who feel lost, who feel hopeless, who have been told that their dreams are impossible and their ideas are foolish. They come from all over the country, sometimes from all over the world, to stand where Coraline and Tobias stood and to feel the warmth of the earth that embraced them when no one else would. Every year, hundreds of visitors come to see the place where Coraline and Tobias Ashford built their impossible home. They marvel at the stone walls that have stood for over a century, every stone placed by hand, every joint sealed with clay and determination. They feel the constant temperature that defied the deadly winter of 1882, the same 55 degrees that has never wavered, not through world wars or economic depressions or the march of time. They read the names carved into the rock, the names of 19 people who survived because two young people refused to turn them away. Some visitors leave letters, some leave flowers, some leave small stones, tokens of remembrance from places they came from. The caretakers collect these offerings carefully, preserving them as part of the cave's ongoing story. And always they ask the same question. How did they know? How did two orphans with nothing, rejected by everyone, manage to build something that saved so many lives? The answer is simple, though it took the world a long time to understand it. They listened. They listened to the wisdom of their father, who learned it from his father, who learned it from generations of miners who understood the earth in ways that books could never teach. They listened to the land, which told them where to build and how to survive. They listened to their own hearts, which told them that kindness matters more than pride, that helping others is more important than proving yourself right. And when the whole world laughed at them, they just kept building. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not what people say about you. Not how they treat you when you have nothing. Not the names they call you or the doors they close in your face. What matters is what you do when they need you most. What matters is whether you become bitter or whether you become better. What matters is whether the walls you build are meant to keep people out or to welcome them in. Coraline and Tobias Ashford chose to build walls that welcome, and those walls still stand today, a testament to what two people with nothing but determination and love can accomplish. Coraline Ashford died peacefully in her sleep in 1927, at the age of 69. She was surrounded by family, by the children and grandchildren of her brother Tobias, by the community that had grown from the seeds she planted all those years ago. Her last words, according to those who were there, were addressed to someone only she could see. "I kept my promise, Father. I kept it." She was buried beside Scout, beside the cave that had been her home and her legacy. The stone marker bears a simple inscription, Coraline Ashford, 1858-1927. She built a home where there was none and opened its doors to everyone. Tobias survived his sister by another 12 years, passing away in 1939 at the age of 75. He was buried beside her, and beside him lies Letty, who had been his wife for 46 years. The three of them rest together in the shadow of the cave that brought them together, the cave that changed everything. Stone never betrays you. Only people betray. But if you build something strong enough, if you open your doors wide enough, eventually the people come around too. They laughed at the cave until it became their salvation, and salvation has a way of changing everything. Thank you for listening to the story of Coraline and Tobias Ashford. If their journey has touched your heart, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, it doesn't matter what people say about you. What matters is what you do when they need you most. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Stories about the power of perseverance, compassion, and never giving up. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.